Before she died, Rocky Dennis's mother revealed a side of their story that the famous film Mask never fully showed. Rocky was remembered as a brave teenager who defied every prediction. But behind that inspiring image was a complicated family life, painful loss, and a mother who refused to let Hollywood tell the whole truth. What did Rusty Dennis finally reveal about her son? And why did some of her words change the story forever? But what happened to Rocky Dennis was far more complicated than the movie ever made it seem. Roy Lee Rocky Dennis was born on December 4th, 1961, in California. For the first part of his childhood, there was no obvious sign that his life would become so unusual. Then, when Rocky was only a little over 2 years old, doctors discovered something seriously wrong with the bones of his skull. He was diagnosed with craniodiaphyseal dysplasia, an extremely rare disorder that caused abnormal bone growth and gradually changed the shape of his face and head. Wikipedia. For most parents, hearing that diagnosis would have been terrifying. But Rocky's mother, Florence Rusty Dennis, reacted differently. She did not want her son to grow up believing that he was helpless. She wanted Rocky to live as normally as possible, even when doctors and other adults saw his condition before they saw the person underneath it. And that decision would shape almost everything that happened next. Rocky's condition was not simply a difference in appearance. The disease could cause serious neurological problems, and doctors reportedly expected his life to be much shorter than that of an average child. Yet Rocky continued growing, learning, making friends, joking, and developing a personality that would eventually become one of the most important parts of his story. There was something remarkable about him. Rocky understood that people stared. He understood that strangers sometimes did not know how to react when they saw him. But instead of allowing those reactions to completely control his life, he developed a sense of humor and confidence that helped him push through uncomfortable moments. That became one of his greatest strengths. Still, the world around Rocky was not always willing to treat him like an ordinary teenager. One of the biggest battles came through school. Because of his appearance and medical condition, there were adults who questioned whether Rocky belonged in a regular classroom. His mother fought against the idea that his physical condition meant he was intellectually disabled. According to accounts of his life, Rocky's intelligence was not destroyed by his disease, and he was able to succeed academically. For Rusty, this was more than an argument about education. It was a fight over who would decide what her son was capable of becoming. Would Rocky be treated like a patient for the rest of his life? Or would he be allowed to become a teenager with dreams, friendships, interests, and a future? Rusty chose the second option, but there was another side to their lives that would later become much harder to understand. Rusty was not a conventional mother. She lived a rebellious lifestyle and was deeply connected to a motorcycle community. Later, when Hollywood turned their story into Mask, Cher's portrayal would make Rusty famous around the world. The movie showed a mother who fought fiercely for her son, but the real Rusty was far more complicated than a simple Hollywood character. She had personal struggles of her own, and those struggles would eventually become an important part of the story. This is where Rocky's life becomes especially difficult to separate from the movie. Because Mask was inspired by real events, millions of viewers assumed they were watching an accurate picture of Rocky and his mother. But the film was a dramatization, and some parts of their lives were changed, simplified, or rearranged for Hollywood. The real question was not whether Rusty loved her son. Evidence strongly suggests that she fought hard for him. The harder question was this: what was happening inside the family when nobody was watching? That question would follow Rusty for the rest of her life. And years later, after Rocky was gone and the movie had turned their story into a worldwide tragedy, Rusty would have her own complicated relationship with the legacy Hollywood had created. But before that story could unfold, Rocky still had something to prove. Doctors had expected a child whose life would be limited by a devastating disease. Instead, Rocky kept moving forward. He went to school. He made friends. He developed interests. He experienced teenage life. And most importantly, he refused to let his appearance become the only thing people knew about him. Rocky eventually lived to 16 years old, dying on October 4th, 1978, from complications associated with his condition. He had survived far longer than the childhood predictions surrounding his disease suggested. His death left Rusty with something no mother should have to carry: the loss of a child she had spent years fighting to protect. And that loss would become even more complicated when Hollywood came calling. Do you think Rocky's greatest strength came from his own personality, or from the way his mother taught him to face the world? Share your thoughts below, because Rocky's death was not the end of the story. It was only the beginning of the part that would make his mother famous. And once Mask arrived, the world would see Rusty Dennis through Cher's eyes. But the real Rusty had her own version of what happened. But Rocky's story was never just about a rare disease. It was also about the woman standing beside him, and the woman who would later become one of the most controversial parts of his story. Her name was Florence "Rusty" Dennis. To movie audiences, Rusty became famous through Cher's performance in Mask. She was loud, fearless, rebellious, and fiercely protective of her son. But the real Rusty was not a simple Hollywood character. Her life was complicated, and some of the choices she made would later create uncomfortable questions about the family behind the inspirational movie. When Rocky was young, doctors gave his mother frightening predictions. His condition was extremely rare, and the abnormal growth of bone in his skull could affect his eyesight, hearing, and brain. Yet Rusty refused to raise him as someone who should simply wait for his life to end. In a 1985 interview with UPI, Rusty explained that she never accepted the idea that doctors could decide exactly how long her son would live. She said she taught Rocky that he could do whatever he wanted, and that he believed he could stay alive as long as he wanted. That attitude became one of the strongest parts of Rocky's personality. Instead of constantly telling him what he could not do, she encouraged him to focus on what he could do. And Rocky listened. He became an honors student. He developed a sharp sense of humor. He loved motorcycles, music, and ordinary teenage experiences. According to the UPI report, he graduated from high school in Southern California among the top students in his class. For a boy who had been expected to suffer severe limitations, that was remarkable. But there was another side to Rusty's life. She was deeply connected to Southern California's biker culture and was known for living outside the rules of a traditional family. Contemporary reporting described her as a motorcycle rider who considered the bikers around her to be family. The movie later turned this unusual lifestyle into part of Rusty's identity. But Hollywood also softened and rearranged parts of reality. That distinction matters, because when people watch Mask, it is easy to believe that every argument, every relationship, and every family conflict happened exactly as shown on screen. It did not. The film was inspired by Rocky's life, but it was still a dramatic movie. Some characters and events were changed for storytelling. Even the relationship between Rocky and his mother was shaped for the screen. And yet, one important truth remained. Rusty fought fiercely for Rocky to be treated as a person instead of a diagnosis. That fight became especially important when people looked at Rocky and made assumptions about his intelligence. His appearance caused strangers to stare. Some people did not know how to speak to him. Others assumed that because his skull and face were so severely affected, his mind must have been affected in the same way. But Rocky repeatedly proved them wrong. He was intelligent. He was funny. And he understood exactly how different people saw him. That is one reason his story became so powerful. Rocky did not spend his life asking people to feel sorry for him. He wanted to participate in life. He wanted to be a teenager. He wanted friends. He wanted experiences. And according to accounts of his life, his mother helped create that attitude. But their relationship was not perfect. The real Rusty had her own struggles, including a history of drug use. Later reporting described how she eventually left that lifestyle behind and became involved with Narcotics Anonymous. This is where the story becomes more complicated than the inspirational version many people remember. Rusty could be fiercely loving and fiercely difficult at the same time. She could fight the medical system for her son while struggling with problems inside her own life. She could give Rocky confidence while living a lifestyle that was far from stable. And that contradiction would become one of the most important parts of the story Hollywood had to decide how to portray. Then came the moment that changed everything. A screenwriter named Anna Hamilton Phelan encountered Rocky at UCLA Medical Center. She was struck by his personality and his positive attitude toward his condition. That meeting eventually led her to the real Rusty and helped inspire the screenplay for Mask. Suddenly, the private life of Rocky Dennis was moving toward Hollywood. But Rusty had a condition of her own. She wanted Rocky's story told. She wanted people to understand who her son really was. And according to later accounts, she was not originally interested in making herself the center of the story. The focus, she believed, should be Rocky and his extraordinary personality. Then Cher entered the picture. Cher was not an obvious choice to play a biker mother at first glance. But once she became attached to the project, the role of Rusty became one of the most memorable performances in the movie. And there was an unusual connection between the actress and the woman she was portraying. Cher later said she believed she understood Rusty's personality and played the character according to her own interpretation. The result was a Rusty Dennis that millions of people would remember. But there was a problem. The world was about to know the movie version of Rusty better than the real woman. And when Mask reached theaters in 1985, viewers saw a powerful story about a mother who refused to accept society's limits for her son. The movie became a critical and commercial success, and Cher received major recognition for her performance. For Rusty, however, the experience was more personal. She had lost her son years earlier. Now his face, his personality, and pieces of his life were being recreated by actors on a giant screen. And millions of strangers were suddenly talking about Rocky. That should have been comforting, but it also created a painful question. Was Hollywood telling Rocky's story, or creating a new one? That question would become even more important as people began comparing the movie with the real family history. Because behind the inspirational story was a family with addiction, conflict, loss, and another child whose story rarely received the same attention. And that was the part of the Dennis family's history that Hollywood largely left in the background. If you enjoy discovering the hidden stories behind famous movies and the real people who inspired them, subscribe, because sometimes the truth behind a beloved film is much more complicated than the version we remember. Rocky's story was about courage, but Rusty's story was about something else too. It was about survival, mistakes, love, and regret. And the biggest question was still waiting. What exactly did Mask leave out? Because once the cameras stopped rolling, the real family's story became darker and far more complicated than anything a Hollywood ending could explain. But the biggest change in Rocky Dennis's story happened after his death, when Hollywood decided that the life of a teenager most people had never heard of belonged on the big screen. Rocky died in 1978, years before Mask reached theaters. His story might have remained known mainly to the people who had grown up around him. Instead, a screenwriter named Anna Hamilton Phelan encountered Rocky and became fascinated by his personality. She saw something that went beyond his appearance. A teenager who could make people laugh, who was intelligent, and who refused to let his condition define him. That encounter helped set the movie in motion. But turning a real teenager's life into a Hollywood film came with a difficult problem. How much of the truth should actually be shown? The answer would change Rocky's story forever. In 1985, Peter Bogdanovich's Mask arrived in theaters with Eric Stoltz playing Rocky and Cher playing his mother, Rusty. The film immediately presented Rocky as someone who wanted what every teenager wanted: friendship, independence, laughter, and a chance to be judged for who he was rather than for his appearance. And that part of the story was powerful. The audience first sees Rocky and notices his face. Then Rocky starts talking. Suddenly, the face becomes less important. That was one of the film's greatest strengths. Roger Ebert wrote that after Rocky begins speaking, viewers quickly accept him as a normal teenager living with an abnormal condition. The movie was not asking the audience to pity him. It was asking them to get to know him. But while Rocky's character was based on a real person, the film did not reproduce his life exactly. That distinction is extremely important. According to reporting from the time, Rusty herself pointed out several differences between the movie and reality. She said the filmmakers changed parts of her story, including the way her drug use was presented. In the film, her drug use is closely connected to personal problems. Rusty disputed that explanation, saying she used drugs because partying was part of her lifestyle. She also said she had stopped using drugs and alcohol. So even the woman being portrayed was telling audiences, this isn't the whole story. There were other differences too. Rocky was a huge fan of Bruce Springsteen. The original version of the movie included Springsteen songs, but the music was later changed because of disagreements over the cost of the music rights. Rusty reportedly said Rocky had never even heard of Bob Seger, whose music appeared in the theatrical version. It may sound like a small detail, but it reveals something much bigger. Every time a real-life story becomes a movie, pieces of reality are changed. Sometimes those changes are made for pacing. Sometimes they make characters easier to understand. Sometimes they create stronger emotional moments. And sometimes they completely change how the audience remembers a real person. For Rocky, one of the biggest differences involved time. The movie compresses years of events into a much shorter period, creating the feeling that everything happened almost as one continuous chapter of his teenage life. Later accounts of the real story noted that the actual events unfolded over many years. That means the audience was watching a concentrated version of Rocky's life. A dramatic version, an emotional version, but not necessarily the complete version. And then there was Rusty. Cher's performance became one of the most memorable parts of the film. She played Rusty as tough, rebellious, unpredictable, and deeply protective of Rocky. Her character was not presented as a perfect mother. She was flawed, sometimes reckless, and struggling with her own lifestyle. Yet underneath all of that was a mother who loved her son. That emotional contradiction made the character powerful. It also made Rusty famous. But fame brought a strange consequence. People who had never met the real Rusty began believing they knew her. They knew the woman from the movie. They knew Cher's version of her. They knew the biker mother. They knew the mother who fought for Rocky. But the real Rusty had lived an entire life that could never fit into 2 hours. And she knew the difference. In a 1985 UPI interview, Rusty spoke openly about her son's life and about the film. She praised Eric Stoltz's performance, but also pointed out differences between Stoltz's appearance and Rocky's real face. She explained that Rocky's eyes were hazel and positioned differently, making an exact recreation impossible. Yet she did not simply reject the movie. She understood what it had done for Rocky's memory. The film introduced his story to millions. People who had never heard his name now knew Rocky Dennis. They knew about his condition. They knew he had lived beyond the grim predictions surrounding him. And they saw a teenager who refused to let strangers decide his worth. That message survived the changes. But there was still something missing. The movie focused heavily on Rocky and Rusty. It did not tell every part of the family's history. One particularly important person was Rocky's older half-brother, Joshua, who was left out of the movie. That omission matters because it reminds us that real families are larger and more complicated than movie characters. There are people who remember events differently. There are relationships that never appear on screen. There are arguments, mistakes, private moments, and painful memories that Hollywood may never show. And that is where the story of Rocky Dennis becomes much more complicated. Because the question is no longer simply, was Mask accurate? The more interesting question is, what did the movie choose not to tell us? Rocky's story became an inspirational Hollywood legend, but Rusty's life continued after the cameras stopped. And unlike the movie, real life did not end with a perfectly written emotional conclusion. There were years of grief. There were personal struggles. There were questions about Rocky's final days. And eventually, Rusty would have to live with something that no Hollywood success could change. Her son was gone. If you have ever watched a movie based on a true story and wondered what really happened behind the scenes, remember this. Sometimes the most powerful parts of a person's life are the parts that never make it onto the screen. And Rocky's story had one more painful chapter waiting. Because after millions of people fell in love with the version of Rocky shown in Mask, the real family had to live with the memories that Hollywood could never completely recreate. And that is where the story gets much darker. But after Mask turned Rocky Dennis into a symbol of courage, the real tragedy was that Rocky was no longer here to tell his own story. He had died in 1978, at only 16 years old. The movie came 7 years later, in 1985. By then, millions of people were discovering a teenager they had never met, learning about his rare condition, his personality, and the mother who had fought to give him a normal life. Mask became a major success and earned strong critical recognition, including an Academy Award for its makeup. But fame did not erase Rusty's pain. It probably made that pain more complicated. Imagine losing your child, then years later watching actors recreate his life on a movie screen. Every scene could bring back a memory. Every line could remind you of something he once said. And every fictional change could make you wonder whether strangers were now remembering a version of your child that never actually existed. That was the strange burden Rusty had to carry. She had wanted Rocky's story to be told, but she also knew the story was bigger than a movie. The real Rocky had dreams that went beyond his medical condition. He loved music. He loved motorcycles. He loved collecting baseball cards. He wanted to travel. He wanted friendships and romance. He wanted to be treated like an ordinary teenager. The film captured some of that spirit, but it could never capture all of it. And there was another painful reality. Rocky's mother had her own life to rebuild after his death. The public mostly knew Rusty as Rocky's mom, but she was a person who had experienced addiction, complicated relationships, and years of personal struggles. Later in life, she became involved with recovery and tried to move forward. Contemporary reporting also described her as someone who believed her unusual lifestyle had been unfairly simplified by Hollywood. This is where the popular image of Rusty becomes difficult. She was not a perfect mother. She was not a villain either. She was a complicated woman trying to raise a child under extraordinary circumstances. And perhaps that is exactly what made her story so powerful. Because Rocky did not need a perfect mother to become extraordinary. He needed someone who believed he was capable of more than other people expected. Rusty gave him that belief, but belief could not protect him from everything. His condition remained dangerous. And in October 1978, Rocky died in his sleep. The real cause of his death has sometimes been described differently in popular accounts, but reliable biographies generally connect his death with complications associated with his condition. What is certain is that he was only 16. That loss became one of the emotional foundations of Mask. The movie's final scenes show Rusty discovering that Rocky has died. She collapses into grief. The moment is devastating because the audience has spent the entire movie watching Rusty fight against predictions that her son would not survive. Then suddenly, there is nothing left to fight. The movie ends with her accepting that Rocky is gone. But real grief does not end when the credits roll. There is no final scene, no perfect goodbye, no music telling you when the pain is supposed to stop. There is only the empty space left behind. And Rusty lived with that space for decades. Then came another complicated part of the legacy. The success of Mask meant Rocky's name would never completely disappear. His face became associated with courage. His story became an example of someone overcoming expectations. His mother became famous because of him, but that fame also meant that the public could continue discussing the family long after the family had moved on. And some of the stories told online today go far beyond what can actually be proven. Claims about secret revelations, dramatic final confessions, or shocking statements from Rusty are repeated constantly. But there is an important difference between a verified interview and an internet rumor. Rusty did speak publicly about Rocky and about Mask. In a 1985 UPI interview, she discussed the differences between her real life and the film and explained her feelings about how Hollywood portrayed her. That is real. What is much harder to prove are the sensational claims that she supposedly made a devastating final confession shortly before her death. Rusty died in 2006 at the age of 70. Her obituary reported her death and remembered her as the mother of the boy whose life inspired Mask. But the evidence does not support turning her final years into a fictional confession simply because it makes a better headline. And that matters, because Rocky's real story is already powerful enough. We do not need to invent another tragedy. We do not need to create a secret that may never have existed. The truth is more human. A mother lost her son. A filmmaker turned his life into a movie. Millions of people connected with that movie. And the woman who had known Rocky better than almost anyone else had to watch the world create its own memory of him. That is the hidden price of fame. Sometimes fame does not belong to the person who becomes famous. Sometimes it belongs to the people left behind. And Rusty was one of those people. She carried Rocky's memory long after the world had finished crying over the movie. But there was still one more question. What did Rusty actually think about the movie that made her famous? Because her answer was not simply, "I loved it." She had praise. She had criticism. And she knew exactly where Hollywood had changed the truth. If you have ever lost someone you loved, you understand something the audience of Mask could only see from the outside. grief does not disappear because the world remembers the person. Sometimes, remembering them makes the absence feel even stronger. And for Rusty, Rocky's legacy would continue long after the movie left theaters. His story had become bigger than his short life. But the real legacy of Rocky Dennis was not his appearance. It was not the movie. It was not even the tragedy. It was the way he lived while knowing the world might never understand him. And that is what made his story impossible to forget. But there was no real empire waiting for Rusty Dennis after Mask. Unlike many celebrity stories, this was never a tale of businesses, investments, or a fortune built from fame. Her greatest legacy was something much more personal: Rocky's story itself. When Mask was released in 1985, Rusty had already lived through the hardest part of her life. Her son had been dead for nearly 7 years. The movie suddenly brought his memory back into public view, and it changed her life in ways she could never have expected. Rusty received money for the rights to her story, but the amount was modest by Hollywood standards. Sources report that she was paid about $15,000 for the film rights. That number is important because it destroys one common misunderstanding about the story. Rusty did not become a wealthy Hollywood celebrity because Mask was successful. She became the woman everyone wanted to ask about. What was Rocky really like? Was the movie accurate? Was she really like Cher's character? Did Rocky really live the way the film showed? And perhaps most importantly, what did Hollywood get wrong? Rusty had answers. She had opinions. And she was not afraid to say that Mask was not a perfect copy of her life. In interviews around the film's release, she explained that she had expected the movie to focus more directly on Rocky. Instead, she felt that Hollywood had created a dramatic version of her own life as well. That is a fascinating part of her story. She had helped open the door for Hollywood. But once the movie was finished, she no longer controlled the story completely. The public now had its own version. Cher's Rusty was loud and fearless. The real Rusty was certainly rebellious. But she was also a woman with years of complicated experiences behind her. And those experiences did not disappear because a movie became successful. In fact, they followed her. Rusty continued to live outside the traditional Hollywood world. She remained connected to motorcycles and the biker community, something that had been part of her identity long before Mask existed. But her later years were not easy. Her life included further struggles with drugs and the law. Her 2006 obituary reported that she had pleaded no contest to methamphetamine possession in 1999 and later received probation for another drug possession case. That reality makes her story much harder to package as a simple, inspirational tale. She was a mother who fought fiercely for Rocky. She was also a woman who made serious mistakes. Both things can be true at the same time, and perhaps that is what Hollywood had trouble showing. Real people are rarely heroes or villains from beginning to end. They change. They fail. They recover. They fall again. They love people deeply while still struggling with their own problems. Rusty's life was exactly that complicated. But the most painful part of her later years had nothing to do with Hollywood. It was another family tragedy. Rusty's older son, Joshua Mason, was also facing a serious battle. According to biographical accounts, Joshua was diagnosed with AIDS-related Kaposi sarcoma in the 1980s and died in 1987 at the age of 32. Think about what that meant for Rusty. First, she had lost Rocky at 16. Then she lost Joshua. 2 sons. 2 devastating losses. And suddenly, the story of Rocky Dennis was no longer simply about a boy who died young. It was about a mother who had to keep living after losing both of her children. That changes the meaning of everything. When people watched Mask, they cried over Rocky, but they did not have to wake up the next morning and live without him. Rusty did. And after Joshua's death, Rusty reportedly spoke about her children's lives in a way that revealed something powerful about how she viewed them. She did not want their lives reduced to the way they died. She believed they had lived fully, even though they had not lived long. That idea became central to the way she remembered them. And perhaps that was the real fortune she carried. Not money, not fame, not Hollywood recognition. Memory. Rocky's story had reached millions. Joshua's story was much less known. But to Rusty, both were her sons. Both mattered. Both deserve to be remembered as human beings rather than tragedies. And this is where the title of our story needs to be handled carefully. There are modern articles claiming that Rusty finally broke her silence before her death and revealed shocking secrets about Rocky. But the available historical record does not establish a dramatic final confession matching those sensational headlines. What we can verify is more interesting. Rusty spoke publicly during the promotion of Mask. She discussed Rocky, her own life, the differences between reality and the movie, and how she felt about the way Hollywood portrayed them. That is the real revelation. She did not need a secret final confession. Her own interviews already showed that the movie was only part of the story. And that distinction matters because Rocky's legacy should not depend on an invented twist. His real life was remarkable enough. He was diagnosed with an extremely rare condition. Doctors expected severe problems. He continued attending school. He developed his own personality and sense of humor. He lived to 16. And after his death, his story inspired a major Hollywood film that introduced him to generations of people. Rusty became the keeper of that memory. Not perfectly, not without mistakes, but passionately. And perhaps that is why her story still attracts attention decades later. People are not only interested in Rocky's face. They are interested in the woman who refused to let the world see only his face. Everyone has someone whose story they want remembered correctly. Someone who may have been misunderstood. Someone whose life was more complicated than the version other people tell. Maybe Rocky's story reminds us that a person's greatest legacy is not always the amount of time they had. Sometimes it is the way they changed the people who knew them. Rusty spent the rest of her life carrying that legacy. But her own story was approaching its final chapter, and the ending would come suddenly. In October 2006, Rusty was seriously injured in a motorcycle accident. She later died at Beverly Hospital in Montebello at the age of 70. Her death was reported in November 2006. The woman who had spent decades connected to motorcycles was gone. And once again, Rocky Dennis's family was facing loss. Only this time, there was no movie waiting to turn the tragedy into a dramatic ending. There was only memory. And there was one final question left. What should the world actually remember about Rocky Dennis? Not the mask, not the makeup, not the Hollywood version, the person underneath it. But Rocky Dennis left behind something that no movie could ever fully recreate. A life that proved people can be remembered for far more than the way they look. Rocky died in 1978 at only 16 years old. 7 years later, Mask brought his story to millions of people. The film became a major success, and Eric Stoltz's performance helped audiences see Rocky not as a medical case, but as a teenager with humor, intelligence, dreams, and fears. And that may be the most important part of his legacy. Rocky was never supposed to become famous. He never had a long career. He never built a business empire. He never had decades to grow older and tell his own story. His entire life was only 16 years. Yet those 16 years were enough to leave an impression that lasted generations. His mother, Rusty, became an important part of that legacy. But her story also ended in tragedy. Florence Rusty Tullis died in 2006 at the age of 70, nearly 3 decades after Rocky's death. According to her obituary, she had suffered serious injuries in a motorcycle accident and died about a month later at Beverly Hospital in Montebello. By then, Mask had already become part of American film history. But Rusty never completely disappeared from the story. People continued to ask about her. They wanted to know what the real woman was like. They wanted to know how much of Cher's performance was accurate. And they wanted to know what really happened inside the Dennis family. The answer is not as simple as many internet headlines make it sound. There is no solid evidence of a dramatic final confession from Rusty that suddenly exposed a secret version of Rocky's life shortly before her death. What we do have are her public comments, contemporary reporting, and the known differences between the real family and the movie. Those differences are important. Rusty herself acknowledged that Hollywood changed parts of their story. The movie compressed events that actually happened across roughly a decade or more, and Rocky's older half-brother Joshua was left out completely. That means Mask should be understood for what it was, a powerful film based on a true story, not a perfect documentary. And that distinction protects Rocky's real legacy. Because when we remove the Hollywood exaggeration, what remains is still extraordinary. A teenager with an extremely rare disorder lived much longer than many people expected. He went to school. He succeeded academically. He developed friendships. He found humor in situations that could have destroyed his confidence. And he experienced ordinary teenage dreams in a life that was anything but ordinary. That is the story worth remembering. Not simply that Rocky looked different, but that he refused to allow other people's reactions to become his identity. And that lesson reaches far beyond Rocky. Think about how quickly people judge others. A face, a disability, a mistake, a background, a difficult past. People often see one thing and believe they understand the whole person. Rocky's life challenges that way of thinking. He reminds us that the first thing we notice about someone may be the least important thing about them. And perhaps that is why Mask continues to affect people decades later. The film made audiences uncomfortable at first. Then it made them laugh. Then it made them care. And finally, it made them grieve. Roger Ebert described this transformation in his review, noting that after Rocky begins speaking, the audience quickly stops focusing on his unusual appearance and begins seeing him as an ordinary teenager living with an extraordinary condition. That was the real power of Rocky's story. He made people look twice, then look beyond what they saw. And there is another lesson in Rusty's story. She was complicated. She made mistakes. She struggled with addiction. She lived a life far removed from the traditional image of motherhood. Her later legal troubles are documented, including a 1999 no-contest plea involving methamphetamine possession and another drug possession case in 2001. Yet reducing Rusty to those mistakes would also be unfair. She was the woman who raised Rocky. She fought for him. She believed in him. And she helped create the environment in which he learned not to surrender to other people's expectations. Two truths can exist together. Someone can be deeply flawed and still deeply love their child. Someone can make terrible mistakes and still leave behind something meaningful. That is what makes Rusty's story human. And it is why the sensational version of this story misses the point. There does not need to be a shocking secret. There does not need to be a hidden confession. There does not need to be a final twist. The truth is already emotional enough. A boy was born with a condition that changed his appearance. His mother refused to let that condition decide his entire life. He lived, laughed, learned, and dreamed. He died young. Then Hollywood turned his life into a movie. And his mother spent the rest of her life living with both the memory of her son and the public version of their story. Everyone has a part of their life that other people cannot see. Maybe you have felt misunderstood. Maybe someone judged you before knowing you. Maybe someone you loved was remembered differently by other people than they were by you. That is why Rocky's story still matters. Because underneath all the medical details and Hollywood drama was something simple. He wanted to live. And he did. Not for 60 years. Not for 80. But for 16. And he made those years count. So, when people remember Rocky Dennis today, perhaps they should remember the boy before the movie. The teenager who made people laugh. The student who succeeded despite expectations. The son who wanted his mother to see him as more than his disease. And the human being who proved that a short life can still leave a very long shadow. Rusty is gone. Rocky is gone. But their story remains. And maybe that is the final truth behind Mask. The most powerful legacy is not always the one you build intentionally. Sometimes it is simply the impact you leave on people who never even had the chance to meet you. Rocky Dennis never knew that millions of people would eventually hear his name. He never knew that Cher would portray his mother. He never knew that a movie about his life would still be discussed decades later. But his story survived. And in the end, perhaps that is more powerful than fame. Because fame asks the world to remember your name. Legacy gives the world a reason to remember why it mattered. Rocky gave people that reason. And that is why, decades after his death, the story of the boy behind the mask still refuses to disappear.